Sandro Botticelli's painting, Pallas and a Centaur, captures a scene from Greek mythology. Pallas Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, is subduing a centaur by grabbing the hair of the mythological creature that represents savagery. So, some people interpret this painting as showing that wisdom triumphs over barbarism, but some historians suggest that the wise figure subduing the barbaric one is none other than Lorenzo de Medici. Why? We'll come back to that. In 1478, Lorenzo de Medici managed to survive the Pazzi Conspiracy, the brutal attack that took place on the Easter Sunday during the High Mass. He lost his younger brother on that day, and he took a swift revenge. He had the conspirators, no matter who they were, executed for this attack. And this included the Pope's closest allies. The conflict between Pope Sixtus IV and Lorenzo reached a point where the two could no longer coexist peacefully. For the Pope, he could not simply back down after his closest allies were executed in Florence, and an archbishop he appointed was hanged in public in Florence, in his ecclesiastical robe no less. Furious, Pope Sixtus IV placed all of Florence under interdict, which is a decree that forbade religious rites in the city, and excommunicated Lorenzo, casting him out of the church entirely. He even declared that anyone collaborating with Florence or Lorenzo would be unforgivable in the eyes of God. But, for all the drama in the Pope's decree, the reality was different. These spiritual punishments were more symbolic than practical, failing to significantly affect Florence's day-to-day life or its thriving economy. And this was particularly so because, when the interdict was announced, the priests in Florence gathered and declared that they would defy the Pope's orders and continue supporting Lorenzo. So, the Pope's frustration only grew, pushing him to seek other means to break Lorenzo's power. And so, the Pope set his gaze southward, to the Kingdom of Naples. At that time, Naples was a force to be reckoned with in Italy, wielding tremendous influence across the peninsula. The city-states of Florence, Milan, and Venice were impressive, yes, but they paled in comparison to the sheer size and the authority of the Kingdom of Naples. This was his next move, to ally with Naples in his battle against Florence and Lorenzo. At the time, the King of Naples was Ferdinand I, also known as Ferrante. King Ferrante took great pride in his role as a mediator and power broker within the Italian peninsula. He believed it was his duty to bring order to the region by resolving the many conflicts that plagued the city-states, by force if necessary. So, when Pope Sixtus IV asked Ferrante to conquer Florence, he didn't hesitate. As a devout Catholic, he couldn't easily refuse the Pope's requests. However, deep down, Ferrante knew that the real blame for the conflict lay with the Pope. Even so, he resented the arrogance of the young Lorenzo de Medici and his apparent disrespect toward the papacy. Deciding to teach Lorenzo a lesson, Ferrante ordered his son to send 1,000 regular troops from Naples to attack Florence. This plunged Florence into a dire situation where the city's survival hung by a thread. The city-states of northern Italy, as splendid and wealthy they were, rarely had standing armies. When it came to warfare, they often hired mercenaries to fight their battles, assembling forces of 10 or 1,500 men at most. In contrast, Naples was sending trained regular soldiers, not hired guns. Mercenaries fought for pay and usually took care to protect themselves by avoiding unnecessary risks. Sometimes, they even had informal understanding between them not to harm each other in battle, because their bodies are their livelihoods. But regular troops were a different matter altogether. These soldiers were professionals of a different kind. They fought to kill and conquer without hesitation. Their arrival meant that this was no ordinary skirmish or game of mercenary maneuvers. This is a real war, and Florence was facing a great threat that it never anticipated. And so, with the mighty forces of Naples looming over Florence, the city found itself on the brink of collapse. Looking at this impending doom, Lorenzo de Medici must have faced moments of deep reflection, realizing that he had underestimated how far the Pope would go in his pursuit of vengeance. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming threat, Lorenzo made a bold, almost unthinkable decision. In the heart of Florence, at Piazza della Signoria, anxious citizens gathered in fear, and Lorenzo stepped forward and said, "I will go to Naples alone. I will go to face death. If my death can save Florence, it will be an honor for me." The crowd erupted in cries of despair, shouting, "No, we will fight to the death for you." But Lorenzo silenced them with these words, "The enemy is not coming to attack Florence. The enemy is coming for me, so I must be the one to face them. I have only a small amount of wisdom and I don't know if it will be enough, but I cannot stand by and watch my beloved Florence fall into enemy hands while I try to save myself. Let me go." The people were overcome with emotion, burst into tears, begging him not to leave. Yet, despite their heart-wrenching pleas, Lorenzo set sail to Naples the next day, embarking on a dangerous mission that could either save Florence or seal his fate. Lorenzo probably sent a word ahead to prepare for his arrival, but even so, to King Ferrante, it must have seemed audacious, perhaps even reckless. He probably thought, what is this young man planning? He wants to negotiate before we go to war? To him, it seemed absurd. Who would dare enter the lion's den? Yet, Lorenzo really did sail into the heart of Naples, arriving in person. When Ferrante heard of his arrival, he was impressed. This was the first moment when Lorenzo truly captured his admiration. It was the winter of 1479, and Lorenzo had braved the winter seas to reach Naples. Upon his arrival, Ferrante welcomed him with a grand banquet. On the surface it seemed like a gesture of hospitality, but in truth Lorenzo was effectively being held captive. Ferrante, now in his mid-50s, found himself face-to-face with 30-year-old Lorenzo. And as the days passed, he grew increasingly fascinated by this young man's intelligence and spirit. Lorenzo recounted in detail all that has transpired between him, the Pazzi family, Florence, the Archbishop of Pisa, and the Pope. As Ferrante listened, he began to understand the deeper political intrigue at play. It was not just a personal feud. Pope Sixtus IV harbored grand ambitions, and Ferrante started to realize that this young Florentine was not merely standing up for himself, but for his city against the Pope's growing tyranny. Over several months, Ferrante observed Lorenzo closely, coming to appreciate his character and judgment. In Lorenzo, he found not only a brilliant mind, but a potential ally. Eventually, Ferrante couldn't help but admire Lorenzo's strength and resolve. The king decided that Lorenzo has passed what was essentially a test, an informal but rigorous examination of his worth. And in this process, Lorenzo truly excelled. He had researched King Ferrante and knew what topics would interest him. Lorenzo skillfully aligned himself with Ferrante's concerns, carefully framing the Pope's actions. And he made King Ferrante realize something crucial. By siding with the Pope and allowing him to seize control of Florence, Ferrante himself could become the next target of the papal ambition. By the end, Ferrante took Lorenzo's hand and declared, "You and I now hold the fate of the Italian peninsula in our hands." He released Lorenzo and switched side to ally with him. For Ferrante, who prided himself on his power and strategy, Lorenzo wasn't just a diplomat. He was a rising star, someone with great potential. This was no ordinary negotiation. It was the beginning of a strategic partnership that would reshape the political landscape of Italy. The encounter between these two men became legendary. If you visit Florence today, you can still see a painting that depicts this iconic meeting. Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, there's a ceiling fresco showing King Ferrante gently patting Lorenzo on the back, a symbolic gesture of their newfound alliance. The artwork captures this monumental moment, when Lorenzo, having ventured into the lion's den, not only survived, but won over the lion itself, returning with Firenze as an ally. Now, imagine the emotions of the citizens of Florence during this time. When Lorenzo had set off for Naples, they wept bitterly. They were certain they were sending their beloved leader to death. They believed they would never see him again. But then, against all odds, Lorenzo returned victorious. Seeing their young leader back from almost certain death, the relief and awe must have been overwhelming. Lorenzo had proven himself to be both brave and wise, and from that day on, his reputation soared. He was no longer just Lorenzo. He became Il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, the great leader of Florence. The bitter feud between Lorenzo and the Pope spanned 2 years and drew in the army of Naples, but ultimately, after his risky voyage to Naples and the diplomacy that followed, the tables were turned. And through this experience, Lorenzo realized something, and it's that not every battle could be won by force alone. His victory was not from the battlefield, it was a triumph of diplomacy and intelligence. So after he returned to Florence, Lorenzo sought reconciliation with the Pope. The Pope might have still carried on with hostilities, but something else happened. An Ottoman fleet, carrying over 14,000 troops, had captured the fortified port city of Otranto in the heel of Italy. Even for Pope Sixtus, this was no time to be fighting a war. He reconciled with Lorenzo in November of 1480 and lifted the interdict on Florence and Lorenzo's excommunication. So what does this have to do with the Pallas and the Centaur? If you look closely at the background of the painting, you will see something you would likely miss unless you know the story already. Between Athena and the Centaur, you can see a distant mountain, and in the foreground, there's a ship. And this isn't just any ship. It represents the very one that Lorenzo took on his daring journey to Naples. So, now it seems clear that the wise one, Pallas Athena, symbolizes Lorenzo. Then, who is the barbaric one, the Centaur? Is it the Pazzi, King Ferrante of Naples, or even Pope himself? Would Botticelli go that far? Anyways, during Lorenzo's time, Florence reached the pinnacle of its golden age. His wisdom and leadership brought unprecedented prosperity to the city. In our next video, we will continue with the story of Lorenzo and his descendants. So please like and subscribe to continue receiving our stories from history. Also check out our playlist for other series from French and Spanish history. It really helps a small channel like us.